Glad we did some quick introductions here. We have an hour of time, but we also have a very rich topic. And I have a little bit of structure to start out, but I think that over time it's our desire this becomes more freeform. And with this group, if you all know these gentlemen, you know that freeform is probably, whether I wanted it to go that way or not, probably what's going to happen. So I'm kind of just admitting that that's what's going to happen. We have a desired outcome here. We want this to be more than a discussion where we said, oh, that's a good talk. We want outcomes where we take your input during this panel. So maybe you have a question, but maybe you have a comment. We want your comments. This is being recorded. We intend to distill that and then publish this as recommendations for how do we improve the way we as a community are addressing the generation of the acquisition of cyber capabilities as we get on a war footing. So we don't hope for war. This discussion is not about what's going to happen between now and 2027 or now and 2030, but there are plenty of discussions that would ratify there's a likelihood, and we need to have our act together. And some of the things that we are prioritizing in the acquisition process perhaps should be deprioritized a little bit, and then other things may be enhanced in order to get the right capabilities into the hand of the warfighter in all operational domains. You raising your hand already?
No, I was going to point to an empty chair. If somebody
Okay.
wants to come sit up front, there's another empty chair over here, too.
You won't be part of the panel.
Yeah.
Well, you might get roped in.
The
But
guest
Yeah.
speaker part of the panel here.
Yeah.
I did try to rope General Novotny back into it this morning, but was not successful. So with that being said, we're going to start with a brief history of acquisition from
Yeah.
Admiral, from the Admiral here,
No.
and then I'll give each of the panelists an opportunity to just give your initial thoughts,
Yeah.
and then I'll come back with some questions. But at any time, if you all have something you'd like to ask or input into this, please do.
So a hazy recollection of a dim memory of what I think I remember from history about acquisition. My perspective, never been charged with operating or supporting an acquisition program. Never had a holder of a technical warrant in the Navy or the Joint Force for any kind of kit or acquisition requirement. I will say I've been a frustrated consumer of kit and services and capabilities from a process inside the department. And I suspect, like some, maybe all of you, to a point that have been on the tail end of receiving capability, it almost never came as advertised. But as I've talked to professionals in this space, they would tell you, and being very cognizant of being recorded for posterity, or posterior, it actually came as specified in the requirement document. So I think observation about the history of acquisition is you kind of unfortunately do, at least the DoD, get what you contract, and you probably also get what you pay for in terms of the low bid. But that being said, I don't know how we got into this circumstance, right? So I grew up in the Navy where my ship was, when I showed up in 1987, it literally was a 100-year-old idea from the Royal Navy called a dreadnought, which became the modern era battleship from a U.S. perspective, the Great White Fleet under Teddy Roosevelt, as it embraced a view of globalism and acting on the world stage. And that became my ship, the battleship Missouri, commissioned in 1944, having been laid down in the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard, not too far from where Jay hangs his hat in the city. And 30,000 people worked on that ship. And any number of well-endowed foundations could gift the U.S. government $1 trillion today, and the U.S. as a nation could not build that ship today. It is impossible. It cannot be bought with money because the necessary resource materials and industrial fab materials don't exist. The government, for the first 150-ish years of its existence, was very comfortable and in fact had the responsibility to operate arsenals and armories and foundries and shipyards. Stuff did not get exclusively built by the private sector because as the nation was building, that kind of a private sector didn't exist. And I think we still have this culture in the modern era force today where we think and act like that's all US government DoD resource, that we own that infrastructure to deliver that kit. And there's been, in my judgment, a significant departure or separation from where we are historically with our culture and where we need to find ourselves today. But there are some good examples, right? You can read any number of books about how good the USM-16 was as an infantry assault weapon. There was a journey to get that good, and it has been subsequently replaced. Or you can take a look at the AK-47, the most proliferated weapon in the history of mankind, and still, some would say, doing a fair dinkum and good job on that mission space. You can take a look at, F-16 or F-18 or F-35 or F-22, and I think there was probably no American pilot that would not want to fly in one of those airframes, and given an opportunity and to fly in someone else's airframe, they'd probably say, I'll take a pass. But I think that gap in superiority and delivery is closing, and we don't have that industrial capacity or capability to deliver the advantage to the warfighter today. And my assertion would be that the US government and DoD has not paced where the private sector is and where the market force is driving cyber. And I think that we're still not accepting that the US Department of Defense and its maneuver cyber forces are simply a consumer, yet another consumer, and in fact, at scale, a fairly small consumer of capability and advanced technology in this space. And so the US has not got past where it thought it owned and controlled. It certainly no longer owns, and it has stopped controlling the marketplace, at least in this sector, probably from its inception. It just didn't recognize it. So 2 cents on history.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Brian, opening thoughts?
I'll fast forward to kind of current. My framework on this, I'm a year into transition out of the Marine Corps. I left Camp Lejeune, Fleet Marine Force, out on the quote-unquote tactical edge, commanding an information group with cyber capabilities, with essentially the Marine Corps' version of a cyber protection team. And here's the challenges I saw, and I think we need to understand how to reconcile, is one, perhaps a lot of our conversations, communities like this, are cyber mission force focused and CyberCom and all that. Those are all good and appropriate, but services have a ton of cyber equities and a ton of cyber talent out there. So I found my own service acquisition process wasn't operating fast enough to get me the capabilities that my Marines thought we needed to really compete in cyberspace each and every day. We were doing that each and every day out in cyberspace, and that wasn't happening quick enough. And so I think let's not forget about the services and those equities as we talk about larger cyber capabilities. But the real gap I saw, and I think we could probably do some work against, is enabling the talent. I had Marines that knew how to code, knew how to script, and could build me a capability that I could then employ, but policy authorities weren't quite there. And in addition to all the industry capability that I had inside my command, how does that all work together? I don't think we're quite there yet. I think this is all about the people, and where you say, where is the expertise to do these things? It's often right in our own formations, even in the services. And I even had Marines who just did coding in their free time and would want to come in and help build operational capabilities. But again, that structure wasn't there to really enable that at scale and speed. And I think the people aspect of this, we just can't lose sight of on this. Enable the talent that already exists in the formations.
And Brian has a Marine Corps Gazette article on that a couple of years back, right? With the Marines who improvised radios.
So biased Marine, I believe Marines are hackers by nature. And I don't mean it from the MCPA hacker sense. It's like, give a Marine a problem, he or she doesn't have all the tools, they will figure something out given enough time and impetus from the command to do it. And so again, I think it is all about the people, enabling them with authority and policy. And we all know this, particularly I had that Marine come to me and go, hey sir, I think this will work. okay, where's the testing and development environment that's still not there in the Fleet Marine Force to actually prove these capabilities can work before I say, yeah, let's go fire that thing. Got to bring the lawyer into the conversation and make sure my boss is good with that too. So there is a supporting infrastructure needed to enable the talent, for sure.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Chris?
So full disclosure, most of the people on this panel, there's only, this is a very, very small community. So there's only really 1 degree of separation. I would argue there's only maybe 2 degrees of separation from anybody in this conference to anybody else at this conference. For me, the way I want to tell my story is a little bit of a vision quest, because when I came to this problem initially, it's when I showed up at CYBERCOM back in 2008, when Hank was the fires chief and Captain White was leading the CAG, trying to formulate what it is exactly we were supposed to be doing here. I was running one of the OPTs, the China OPT at the time. And we would have this question back, like, where's our, hey, we're trying to do something. Where's the capabilities? Like, where was the JMEMs, right, for the military people? Where are the tools that we have at our disposal? And we found out those never really existed. Like, that they weren't there at the time. So as a reservist, sort of bouncing back and forth between, times in uniform and times in industry, I've been chasing this idea for a long time with many people in this room. My most recent experience being the principal cyber advisor for the Department of the Navy was mostly trying to advocate for this space in a very, very competitive environment. And when you think about all the things that the Department of the Navy does, including the Marine Corps, I had a chance to meet all the MiG commanders, and at the time I thought the MiG construct that the Marines were rolling out was one of the more mature ways of thinking about service-retained cyber capabilities and the way the Marines were going to go about at the MEF level to support the MEF and push units down lower. I was like, that was a very, very mature way of looking at it, but even the Marines were struggling for the people and the resourcing to sort of fully flush that vision out. So then we formulated within the Department of the Navy that secure, survive, strike idea. If those of you have read it or not, it's worth a read. It takes about 2 seconds. But the argument that we were trying to make at the time was, the genesis of that was every time we said the word cyber, 99% of the time the word security immediately followed it, which meant this was a zero trust conversation, which meant this was we'll go write a check to some vendor to show up with a tool and we'll solve our zero trust problem. And the argument that I was trying to bring forth is the PCA to differentiate from the CIO is, well, wait a minute, there's a whole war fighting thing that we do here as well. Well, what do you mean by that, Chris? And I'd say this to make a joke, and I'd say, look, what does the Columbia-class submarine, the Joint Strike Fighter, and the Abrams tank all have in common? And it's not cyber vulnerabilities. So none of those platforms were designed to deliver humanitarian aid, right? It typically gets a laugh. Why, man, this is a rough crowd. But after the business of what we do is to deliver lethality or prevent lethality from being delivered upon us. We've opened up the aperture to now include things like non-kinetic activities, defense of supply chains, defense of all the other things that go into that, cyber being part of that. And the fight that we were trying to make at the time was, how do you advocate for capabilities that then get resourced, that then get prioritized against things like the Columbia-class submarine, the Joint Strike Fighter, and the Ford aircraft carrier. These things that just suck all the oxygen out of the room when those conversations come down, because they are billions and billions of dollars and require hundreds and hundreds of people to operate. And now you're trying to come and you're trying to advocate for cyber as a warfighting domain alongside these other things, to TJ's point, that we've done for a long, long time, that are clearly understood. Now I would argue that anybody in this room that wears the uniform, I don't care what service you're in, I don't care what branch or community you were within that service, I bet everybody in this room can have a somewhat intelligent conversation on Army armor operations. I think everybody knows what an F-18 is, what a submarine is, what special warfare looks like. And we could probably go around the room and we could probably name every weapon system the military has, and to a subset, every weapon that exists within those weapon systems. Because that's just the culture we grew up in. We understand it, we see it in the movies, we see it in the history classes. But if I went around to that same group, and this is the argument I would make with some of the pilots, and I'd say, look, I know pilots can talk submarines and submarines can talk amphib. Name me a cyber capability. And they'd go, flank speed. And I go, no, right? So there's so little awareness of what this community brings to that community. Now, why is that? Well, for years and years and years, we've lived behind the proverbial green door, and we were super secret, and we weren't going to talk about the things. And there were lots of good reasons why we did or didn't do that thing. I think the conversation with industry opens up an interesting one, because Not unlike all those weapon systems I just said, the Department of Defense does not make any of those things. Shoelaces, uniforms, munitions, platforms, all of that comes from industry. Well, how do you have that conversation with industry to build me a battleship? So I'd say, well, there are parts of this conversation that I would argue we can have it in unclassified dimension. And again, I'll use the Columbia-class submarine to make my point. Arguably the most sensitive weapons system the Department of the Navy is putting out right now. I don't know anything about it technically. I don't know how deep it goes. I don't know how quiet it is. I don't know what the range, yield, or accuracy of its weapons are. Those are all classified facts for very, very specific reasons. But I know it goes underwater. I know it's probably going to be quieter than the Ohio class. I know it's going to carry nuclear weapons. We talk about that stuff all the time. I know how many we're going to buy, how much they're going to cost, when we're going to deliver them, and why all of that is important to the Navy, because that's how the Navy justifies the spending on all these things. All of that is an unclassified conversation. So why can't we begin to have an unclassified conversation? And I think Jay sort of framed it really well of what does cyber as a means and methods of warfare mean to the department? Again, I'll use the Moneyball thing. Hey, there is an offset here if we could figure out how to do this, because by its nature, it's fundamentally less expensive than everything else we're going to go do. The other adversaries, China in particular, is going to outbuild us. Like, that ship has both figuratively and literally sailed. We will never be the largest Navy again, I think.
Unless we sink theirs.
Unless we sink theirs, which is part of it. But for all the things that underpin that, how do we champion and advocate for the resourcing of these things? And I'll go back to the one part that I didn't get to in my opening comments. I'll get a little more detail. Like, I called it the 5 C's. Now, for those of you who have been to the War College, there's deterrence theory, and it's made up of the 5 C's of deterrence theory: capability, capacity, credibility, commitment, and communications. Now, I think when cyber became of interest to us, I mean the Department of Defense, we started working on capabilities. And to a lesser degree, we started trying to scale those capacity. I think the piece that's never been established, and I think the most important C of all the 5 C's, is the credibility of the domain. For those of you who just came from RSA, we give our adversaries a lot of credibility of the things they can do, which drives huge markets here. And RSA is basically that, and Black Hat and DEF CON and some combination of that, is giving credibility to our adversaries' ability to do things to us. So that's when we start walking with industry, academia, thought leadership, whatever that is, to start bringing credibility to the space. Because then what that allows is the next 2 C's, which I would argue are the most important 2 C's. The commitment. It allows a leader to commit to this and then communicate to the force that this is important, this is the path we're going to go down now. The commitment and the communication to this is the thing that I still think is lacking, and that was when you get into the policy world of the Pentagon, where the things like, well, this is what the PCAs can go do. Can we work and establish credibility, get leaders to commit through resourcing, through prioritization, through whatever, and then be able to clearly communicate that to the vision. Once again, I think that's what the core of the MCPA can ultimately do, is sort of carry the water for those last three things. Establish credibility, help us commit to this as a thing that we're going to invest in, and then communicate collectively out to everybody who will listen that this is important.
I think you said each of those 3 last C's were the most important C.
When everything's important.
Yeah.
Shut up with everything.
Look, I think there is something maybe that uniquely distinguishes what does or doesn't happen in cyberspace. The Navy for a long time knows how to generate sailors. Good uniform dungarees, new uniform, camis, whatever. The Army's know how to generate soldiers. Marine Corps generates Marines. Each of those services provide to those uniformed personnel kit and capability. And typically they launch that kit and capability downrange, or they maneuver in adversary space to do their operations. But I think our operators, our warriors in cyberspace, whatever uniform they wear, maybe the jury's out on that, we're going to expect them to not only maneuver in adversary space, but employ capabilities in adversary space. But at the same time, that capability is going to be a sensor at the same time as it might be defensive purely in nature or offensive in nature. And the very best of us, like the conversation about SOCOM, 10% of the lethal force, but underpinned by a whole bunch of enablers in another conversation, we're going to expect those forward to exist temporally and in cyberspace, operating, securing, defending, and being offensive. And the very best of them are probably going to be changing that kit. They're going to be operating in the user environment, and they're going to change the kit that they come with. They're going to have to, because the adversary is going to maneuver in real time against that capability. And I don't know that our nation, you, the industry that's here, is postured to completely let it go. That doesn't look like a profitable service contract. You know, when you give it over fully and you don't have sustainment behind it. You know, I think there are some things that we can approach radically differently. I do think we're doing a shitty job in communicating capability, and I don't think we're oversubscribing to adversary capability. But it's tough to overlook. When we were doing this in 2008-9, I mean, maybe there were 2 headlines a week that would appear not on the front page across all of the periodicals, Times, Journal, Post, whatever, about something in cyberspace. But now, you know, there is not a day that goes by that there are not multiple articles about, at least from, you know, my perspective, what I care about the most, U.S. government infrastructure, resources, identity, sovereignty getting bitch slapped by the adversary far and wide everywhere in crisis, inside infrastructure and so on. We have not ever confronted that kind of a threat or adversary or intrusion or probe or presence in conventional space. So I think part of it is we are lagging because we haven't yet assimilated how to take it on board.
So I'd like to pull on the communicate thread a little bit, and it'll go back from Chris to TJ on this. I'd like each of you to imagine you're going to buy something important to you and your family. And I recently I've been using a car as an example, but I think I'm going to even switch that to a car seat. Something that is, you know, the mission of that, if you're a parent, is eminently critical to buy that thing to take care of one of your loved ones, but high importance mission. So when you purchased that, did you consider contracting a third party who was not a parent, who knew nothing about car seats, to purchase that for you? Did you think, let's get the absolute cheapest car seat I can get through this third party who's not a parent? Of course you didn't, right? You were intimately involved in that decision. And if car seat doesn't fit for you, then pick car. I'd say everybody in here has purchased a car before. You know, I actually have an exception to that, right? All generalizations fail. I have a guy who manages money for rich people, and he has them go buy their new Mercedes. But, you know, they've kind of started at the top on that, right? So there is an exception. But do you go through a third party who is not a subject matter expert to make that important acquisition? You don't. But I would argue that we do for the capabilities that we need for the mission set. And so I want to go back to, how do we better communicate? You talked about specifications. You talked about communicate. How do we better communicate what is needed so that is what is awarded?
I'll start with who are you, let's say, okay, who are you communicating to, right? Are you communicating to the Secretary of the Navy? Are you communicating to a program office? So I'll just say from the lens that I was trying to make this argument, because having bounced back and forth a couple of times between industry and the government, I will use either the battleship analogy or an Arleigh Burke destroyer analogy to say, look, those platforms are not COTS pieces of equipment. You just didn't go out and buy a COTS destroyer that was available to anybody and said, oh, we'll buy this flavor of destroyer or airplane or whatever. I mean, each of those platforms, by their very nature, were designed, and I would argue one fundamental design characteristic of that, another head nod back to the cyber vision that the Navy put out, was survivability, right? You don't build a destroyer or an airplane to be secure, you build it to be survivable, which is why airplanes have chaff launchers and ejection seats, why destroyers have electronic countermeasure gears and chaff and flares and NIXI and all these things built into the survivability of the platform, with crews that are trained in damage control, with all the things that go along with that. Well, the reality is that all comes at a cost. That's the reason an Arleigh Burke destroyer costs $3 billion, is fundamentally it's being built with the idea that some adversary wants to put it at the bottom of the ocean. And with that in mind, a tank, armor, whether it's reduced radar cross section, whether it's whatever, all of that comes at a cost. And I think
I have no idea why an early bird costs $3 billion when an aircraft carrier costs $15 billion. Completely different. They don't scale, and I think it's because the DoD is kind of. I get it. It's expensive,
yeah.
right? But I don't. I think we've lost control of
But
what
my
value
point is, nobody was debating whether you're going to put a Slick 32 on a destroyer. Right? We're like, we don't really need it on
Yeah.
this. The radar cross-section's gotten so good, we don't no longer need electronic warfare countermeasure gear. Or that airplane is so survivable it no longer needs an ejection seat. I don't think we've ever had that, but I think when we get into the IT space, to your point, is that we go to low cost because I just happen to meet certain design characteristics. None of those things
So
were
maybe-
built to be survivable.
So maybe we can agree to disagree, but the addition of an ejection seat into an aircraft is not a reflection of survivability. It's a reflection of failed lethality, right? And so maybe the answer there, particularly in cyberspace, is code it up. And don't worry about 2,500 pounds in a 9G limited platform, which is going to get outpaced by a weapon at the endpoint, cost 1/10,000th of the capability and can pull 3x the Gs in terminal maneuver and can outrange by a factor of 3. And so I think that's the promise in cyberspace, right? In terms of communication, DoD hasn't told contractors, whether in the open world or the private closed classified world, what victory looks like. And I think maybe that could be something that DoD can communicate. And victory for DoD probably ought to have its pedigree for victory for the nation in cyberspace. And I don't know that I know what that is, but Jay, you can write about it, and others will follow, and they'll disagree in public. And then we will advance the plan, right? Or any one of you in the room could write about it. The midshipman third class, go Navy. She could write about it. And in fact, her thinking, similar to your point about Marines as operators and warfighters, she probably has a better perspective on what we need than anybody in the room, because she's probably closer to the real world application, just like the Marines in the fight were closer at that point in time. And so I think there's a little bit of trust and commitment, but I don't know how to actually build better trust with industry, right? So as a consumer, of the kit, it always seemed that I was never confident I was going to get what I was told on time and under budget. I really cared about the on time. I didn't care about the under budget because it wasn't my concern. I care about it now as a taxpayer, but I'm just really intrigued. Like I struggle with, the people piece.
I've got one observation on that, and am actually awaiting a comment from the audience here to facilitate the discussion. And I didn't want to escape the fact that Chris actually used Marine and mature in the same sentence, so thank you.
He misspoke. It was an error.
I don't know if that's a win or we need to work on our IO campaign a little bit better, but I think I recognize the challenge when we just talk cyber, and it is all about mission integration, joint cyber warfighting architecture, a lot of pieces, and let's bring that together. But then it's a joint fight, and you need to integrate that with the joint community. What I found challenging, now that I'll put my industry hat on this side, is sometimes we can see the opportunity of the convergence. And what I mean by that is we engage with the customer, and all too often the customer says that this thing's out for compete, I can't talk to you, I'm not comfortable talking to you. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. I want to talk about the mission integration and how whatever fields, who fields that, how I enable that and identify where the convergence of all these capabilities are happening. That's the space between. I think we need to have conversations. We need to have more free-flowing conversations. I know there are rules and there are things, but we have limited time. So if we have the opportunity to come together and figure out how we can solve challenges together, that's going to help us a lot.
Back to the car seat. I subbed it out to my wife,
A subject matter expert.
a subject matter expert.
But did you install it?
And the one that was going to probably do most of the driving, right? So where the rubber meets the road, literally.
Yep.
But I do take your point, right? I didn't go somewhere, and we did a lot of peer review. Mm-hmm. And there was also a price point, which is embarrassing to admit, because it makes you feel like you don't value your kid by taking a second mortgage on your house to ensure that you'll get them to and from every activity for the first 3 or 5 years of their life. But maybe we're there at cyberspace, right? I think the promise in cyberspace is the kit doesn't have to cost that much for a unit issue. I think the investment in the architecture and the platform as an integrated combat weapon system might appear to cost a lot, and it's ephemeral. I don't know. I mean, I know what a battleship looks like. That's cool. I know what an F-35, a submarine, or a tank looks like. They're cool too. They're just different. For the uniforms in the room, when you get into a position of leadership and influence, but more importantly, as a position of being an operator and a warrior in this space, demand for the fucking best that you can get. And don't let your leadership explain to you or whinny away or poo-poo why you can't or it's going to come next year. In cyberspace, it can come literally overnight. It can probably come faster than overnight. You know, it is a digital connected world. And I think that you should expect when people show up to assess the quality of your bids in industry, you should expect people that make you nervous. You should expect them to be better than you in the context of the technology, the scope of the work, the expected performance, the deliverables, the expected operational employment and ecosystem and environment, the dynamic range, a thinking, maneuvering adversary. And frankly, I think you don't. I think you too easily foresight on the requirement. You don't push back on what looks to be, in your mind, insufficient, poorly worded requirements, ill-articulated. But I also think that the government is not stepping in to deliver hard, data-driven, past performance-oriented, people.
Do you think the people who do that exist now inside the government? Is that part? Like, if we were building an airplane, it's obviously those people going back and forth.
Operator at Mar 4 Cyber, or at Navy's NetWarcom, or NCDOC, or 16th Air Force, anybody that's down there, civilian and military, that's in that mission space, they don't get invited in. The reason they don't get invited in is not that they're not welcome, it's just that they're overloaded and overtasked, right? They have to be on mission all the time in a force with X billets is manned at maybe 0.75X, and all of it's being chased, right? So, yeah, I think they exist. But I think industry could invite that. Industry could assert and challenge that is an expectation, for being involved in the competition.
Yeah, so I see business development as standing in the gap between connecting to the mission needs, and that's a responsibility. It's not some slimy thing where I'm trying to push something onto the government that doesn't need it. We're trying to make that connection. And to answer your question, I'm the moderator, not a panelist here, I guess, but I've seen both. I've seen mission owners who show some courage and say, I'm going to engage so that you know what we need. And I've seen others who would take a very, personal interpretation of the FAR and say, no, I can't talk to you because then I have to talk to everybody. And then they get that watered down request that doesn't meet the mission needs. Jay, you have a question or comment, please.
Yeah, I was really curious because I wanted to bring us to the warfighting or put the spotlight on the warfighting of cyber weapons. Because it really strikes me, right? I mean, if we're really in a high-end cyber war with China 2028 or so, right? I'm really curious, what changes do we need? And which changes do you think are more important? Right, I know they're all going to be more important, and they're all going to start with C. But is it acquiring the capability? Is it rebuilding the arsenal at the rate that we're burning? How do we do that? And how does that fit in, or is it less important that we do that versus the integrating training, employing mission planning for those capabilities that they're doing? What actually is going to be different for if we're in that? Really, no kidding, folks are dying in the homeland because of adversary cyber operations. What is that going to change?
Well, Jay, look, I don't agree with your premise that we're not in the fight now, and little alarmist perhaps, and so being careful about making it to tape. As a former SIGINTer, it's not real unless it made it to tape. Look, in all the other domains of warfare, as a matter of policy and as a matter of doctrine, the United States is in phase 0 operations, to employ your term from this morning. And it means something deliberate and something specific. There are places around the globe where with conventional maneuver forces, some of them in the special operations arena, but nonetheless a conventional maneuver force at scale, constrained by physics to things that look like human performance envelopes, right? They will respond to a contingency or a crisis, but we are not at national scale conflict, okay? But in cyberspace, my assertion to you is that we are somewhere north of phase 2, probably comfortably in phase 2+. And that is simply a manifestation of what is being reported on in open testimony in front of Congress by leaders of the Pentagon in uniform and civilians, or at DHS CISA, or when you talk about, Microsoft, they're a good company, they're all working really hard, or other sectors that are getting probe, penetrated, attack, right? The United States is, what is the word? Are we being breached? Are we being probed? Are we under assault? Are we being attacked? But you just read about all your shit is getting ripped off, and the adversary, all of them, are conducting what I used to know as advanced force operations in our strategic bastion, in our rear area, in our homeland. I don't know what the hell that looks like. It ain't a balloon at 80,000 feet.
So let's say it's worse. Like, let's say for now I accept your premise. Certainly I accept that it's bad, but we know it can get worse, right? I mean,
Sure.
Like, the ship Turnell sunk. There's 3,000 folks dead in Manhattan, right? We know that we're now in a fundamentally different area. Like, wow, man, we thought we were before. Okay, this is war's way to DoD knows it, and now we need we're burning through magazines of our capabilities. Because they're trying to kill folks and we're trying to kill them.
Magazines of cyber capabilities.
Yeah. How do we get there?
Yeah.
Or we're in that space.
Yeah.
How is this changing? Right? Because obviously it's not going to be we're putting out, in the way that we're doing it now, or we hope.
Yeah.
And by the way, if I can just, it's a semi-comment, because now we know a different model. Like China with the Chen Fu Cup and the way that they're bringing, have nationalized vulnerability discovery, and to bring that in to the PLA. It's not an American model, but it's a very different model, and it's maybe the first time we've had a very different model of generating capabilities.
I think we're our own worst enemy in this space because we haven't been disciplined with language. Let's use the word attack, right? For those of you who are familiar with the Talon Manual, if anybody's familiar with the Talon Manual, it's a reference, it's not law, it hasn't been established as anything, it's a reference. But they do try to define the word attack. Attack by the laws of armed conflict is something designed to injure or kill personnel or damage or destroy equipment. That's an attack. So if we say cyber attack was the intent to do those things, I would argue Stuxnet could be qualified as a cyber attack. Saudi Aramco cyber attack. SolarWinds, I don't know if I'd call that an attack, right? It was a way to get access into countries or companies to try to exfiltrate information, but was it designed specifically with that in mind to do those kind of things? Now, so to TJ's point with the stuff we've seen, pre-positioning critical infrastructure, 2+, there's no intrinsic intelligence value for an adversary to be in some power plant because they could just go buy that stuff. There's nothing that there's being, if they're in a power plant, they're on a piece of Siemens or Schneider equipment, well, they have access to that through the commercial market. There's no reason to be there. You're not trying to steal the plans of that. So that's all pre-positioning, and I would argue things that were sort of prelude to that kind of. And the last thing I want to say is, and TJ and I were having this debate / argument at RSA just last week, and we were talking about how hard, offensive cyber is really hard. It's hard because the adversary can change their infrastructure, or if we show a tool, it's no longer relevant. And I would say, well, look, there's still places in the U.S. Navy where Windows 98 is still deployed, right?
Which wouldn't have said that out loud.
So, well, or to say another one, let's use a kinetic
Neither
example.
confirm nor deny.
Yeah, so,
Chris,
but to Jay's point, though, I mean, and I think it's good to sort of bring it back to the topic, right? And I would ask, you two to weigh on this because you've been a little bit closer to the fight than when I last had it. And I was thinking about something bigger and a little bit farther away from where you were actually generating the force and employing the force, right? Look, I think you can't do one and then the other. What we know about cyberspace is it is a domain which is constrained only by entropy, very little, and or maximum rather, and imagination. Nothing occurs in serial, right? The market does not like serial adoption. It likes fast fail, first mover advantage, and it likes winners and losers, where it competes in the open space. And so I don't think the Department of Defense's approach can be one and then next and then another. I think it has to be a commitment to be focused on as much as we can scale on the human element, which is generate people with skills. The DoD is going to have to become uncomfortable and give them more autonomy, expectation that through training and education and culturization, we'd call that salarization, which begins at boot camp and other places, that they will conduct and comport themselves in a way consistent with ethics, morals, law of armed conflict, and so on. I think we're going to have to go over capacity and capability, which looks like kit and platform, hard. And we're going to have to expect maybe some non-traditional relationships with industry, right? The stuff that we are vulnerable to, we buy from industry. And so maybe we can partner with industry in a fashion to get through what is prioritized and then go after making that more resilient. Hardened is a very hard and overused word, but it's a good word to begin, and people kind of know what that looks like. And then I think for the phase 2+ stuff, Jay, and whoever else agree or disagree, something's going on in cyberspace. The difficult thing is we don't see it. We have to read about it. Occasionally, your water supply might be perturbated, and so your utility is going to ask for some money to fix it. But we just have to agree that this is legit and real and credible. Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but
Yeah,
you guys
I
are
keep
Marines.
coming back to the mission integration, and I'll say fully joint cyber integrated training, so we know what that looks like. Multiple magazines shoot, and I just found far too often that there was large level cyber exercises. You'd think about those type of things, but that didn't match down to what the guys were doing on the ground. And what are the processes and decision cycles you need to actually go, yeah, shoot it or not, still defend at the same time, and to build the trust in the commanders to go, yeah, we're ready for that. I think that's probably where we need to spend a little more time on too, is just a fully integrated joint cyber training, so the joint commanders trust what they're getting when we're starting to shoot cyber magazines at rapid fire. All the capability stuff is absolutely right, but you got to know it, you got to understand it before you employ it.
And I'll come to you in just a second. I know you had a question, sir. Brian, I wanted to make sure I capture this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but operationally, I'll call it not cyber, but in information warfare, did you not have operators who had to have the authority to respond, in the timing and tempo of the adversary? We had to push those authorities down, if you will. It couldn't be a mother may I, because the opportunity would be lost if that was the case.
Well, I think maybe there's just a culture element about that too, is because some of the authorities have been so restricted per se. It's like people don't have the imagination to go and ask for it, and ask for the capability, ask for the multiple magazine, because they're like, it's just too hard, and
POTUS release.
TJ and I were,
POTUS release.
yeah, exactly, talking about back in the day, and you're yelling at the J38.
Yeah.
Now let my guys shoot. Yeah, we're not there yet. So I think it's an imagination.
There is
to
a
even get
cultural hindrance, I would say, as an immigrant into this. So when I came into that Cyber Command NSA environment, people would, I would postulate like what kind of missions we should be able to do. People say, oh, we don't have the authorities for that. And I'd say, well, in artillery, I don't have the authority to fire into North Korea either, but I'm going to train for it, right? We're going to man, train, equip for those potential missions that match up to the CONOPS and the O plans. But we tend to self-limit in this environment, saying, the authority, we don't have the authority to do that. Yeah. I think General Novotny mentioned it this morning. That could change. Well, you mentioned it on what's Execute Japan.
Yeah, execute against Japan, yeah.
Execute against Japan, right? Those authorities could change in a moment, and so we have to be ready for the likelihood, not just for what we have the authority for right now. Yes, sir.
Yes, Jason Cronin, and y'all are touching on a lot of things. You mentioned, bring it back to war footing, bring it back to, yes, we are being attacked. And Admiral, you're right, they're all up inside of us already. So you've got half a dozen commercial names up here on this board, right here, that have the capability to support NSA and Cybercom in offensive operations. A war footing, when World War II, the entire nation came together. I think that was a great point about Execute Japan. It can change on a dime, and I think we're almost past that point. All of these capabilities right here, oh no, you can't do offensive, even though we go to them, or the DoD goes to them to execute offensive. And yes, there are laws, but laws can be changed.
So is the question about, should the U.S. entertain the possibility of a letter of marque in cyberspace for offensive capability?
Oh boy.
And that was brought up last year.
Yeah. So I'm not there yet. So I'll just cut you off right now. I would say for the purpose of intellectual rigor, right, and open and transparent conversations to a point, we should never take anything off the table. And as part of critical review, I mean, if you need it, if this is the only way, right, that you can deliver it, and arriving at a determination it is the only way would be better had as a result of deliberate conversation in the present than sort of making a knee-jerk reaction in the moment, right? I don't think we're there yet. But I do think I do think that a good question that industry could ask of itself and ask the United States government and DoD to entertain is, let's just imagine an apocryphal situation where the nation finds itself wanting to generate an overwhelming amount of cyber capability, to whatever extent that asymptotic curve could be generated. How does industry, without a contract, without an ask, without a legal determination, without anything other than just saying, well, we have a lot of people, and we have a lot of kit, and we have a lot of yet not fully realized code base, let's just show up at the door, roll our sleeves up, and go after it. Now, is there a provision for that? I suspect everyone would say, well, of course we would do that. So let's just actually agree to do that now. And let's agree to have a door to go to, a place to park, or an ecosystem that you can log into with appropriate trust and identity and capability. And there are firms here who generate that stuff, and we can pay later. And if you're worried about getting paid later, well, you're really not going to give a shit if there's no nation later. Right? So the idea would be, what do you do to preserve the nation, to perpetuate the nation, and how can industry accept an aggressively and perhaps an inappropriately aggressive posture to contribute to readiness? To the other point, I think there's merit there, but then there's this conversation rolling around about establishing something like a cyber auxiliary, and I think that there might be a mechanism to do exactly what you're talking about. Attach that capability to something that looks like a cyber auxiliary so that you can have, in a system that Western liberal democracies like the United States like, a authorities regime which is transparent and accountable, or something like that.
And when Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw some of these stories bubble up, where you had non-combatant civilians, Ukrainian civilians, participating in non-kinetic fires, whatever you call it. And there's a precedence for that. I mean, it's levy en masse. If you're occupied and you can take up arms against your occupier. So the question was, well, can you do it in this sense? And well, what if you're Ukrainian, but you're not in Ukraine, you're in Germany doing those kind of things? It opened up all kinds of legal questions, but there is a legal precedent that if you were there, you could pick up a pitchfork, you could pick up arms. And it opened up the question in this space. What would be?
So I don't want to be too critical. I don't want to come across as too critical, but I am critical. But but to the credit of Microsoft, they were there early and they helped out a lot. Starlink, they were there early, they helped out a lot. Both of them continue to help out a lot. I don't know what they got paid on the 24th of February in 2022, and I don't know what they got paid for the next 6 months. Probably pretty close to zero. U.S. authorizations and appropriations hadn't fully completed yet, but they're probably getting some sort of payment now, right? So if there's, if you're in it, that'll be good.
But to your point, industry is assuming some operational risk there as well, right? In order to lean into this, the industry needs to assume risk as well.
Yeah, and I think actually industry could actually potentially organize itself by itself. Well, no, the nation has the most to lose. Let's be very fucking clear, right? The nation has the most to lose, right? So general pushback, all in good humor. But no, I think industry could self-organize and say, well, we don't want to do it. And we really don't want to be told to do it in a way that really is inconvenient and hurts. So maybe we could just come together quietly as professionals in this space and say, let's design a mechanism to offer to the DoD and to the nation something that they can't refuse.
If I can on the two-finger, for folks that are interested, since we're doing the video, if you look up the Cyber Defense Assistance Coalition for Ukraine, CDAC, was stood up by one of the early military cyber professionals, Greg Rattray, and others, and you see the companies, like some of the sponsors, are just chunking in a ton, and they're not getting paid. Like the overall budget for CDAC is a pittance. And these companies have got together. It's not really in their commercial interest to be taking on the Russians, but they're going in. They're volunteering a ton of stuff. They're not getting a lot of requirements. So especially on this, I think I'd love to break.
Yeah, Jay, thanks for that. I'm looking at it.
Question.
I want to go to the gentleman in the back with the sunglasses.
Interesting conversation. It makes me think about a couple of concepts. I'm just going to try to break it down very quickly. I mean, in the end, as I listen to this discussion, it makes me wonder whether this is really a worthwhile or sustainable effort. And when you think about nuclear weapons, for example, no matter how you arrive by one, and even if you look at the Chinese nuke versus an American nuke, everybody respects the nuke. And if one lands on your shore, it's going to do damage now and even 50 years from now. When it comes to cyber, it feels like it's just in time. You know, if you have it today, then there's this question about capabilities to modernization. Everybody can do it. They just wait for you to do it, steal it, then they can do it too. And so, is that just diminishing returns? And where do you get X factors? Meaning, do you just take what industry can create, but the only real reason you would actually buy it is because you can add some X factor, some capability that is brand new, very quickly, that can literally thousands as time as your energy. So I'm just wondering what your perspective would be on.
I think the X factor is going to emerge pretty close to real time at the hands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, Guardians, and civilians that have an expectation of being in the fight. They have been trained to be in that fight, and they are given whatever kit they have to be in that fight. That will be, in my judgment, the X factor that will deliver. I do take your point about, in cyberspace, this idea of commoditization, which we hope we'll never get to with nuclear weapons, also reflecting your point. But if that is the case, then we just have to figure out how to compete more effectively as a nation and mobilize to do that. We can't not fight, right? And so we have to be prepared to do it the way we know how to do it. I am also cognizant to say that the way I know how to do it might come across and be, in fact, the only way, which is not the right way and likely the wrong way. And so again, I think that's going to come from these kind of conversations, right? Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you.
So I had a question over here earlier, or comment.
He asked hard questions.
Okay.
You shouldn't have called on him.
This is for Admiral White.
My question ties together a couple of the themes: legal authorization and personnel preparedness that we've talked about, or you all talked about today. And it is, what will or does ROE look like in the cyber domain? So when I'm in the undersea domain, I think if I'm fired upon, we have the inherent right to respond with offensive capability to seek or destroy the attacker. What does that look like in the cyber domain? You know, if our network is being attacked, do our sailors actually have authority right now to go defend themselves, but they're not at risk of their life and limb? So what does that authority look like, and what does ROE look like in a domain that is growing or bubbling up?
That's like a whole other panel seminar. That's a good one.
That's for next year after we've thought about it.
I'll give a perspective on it. It won't fully satisfy you, but it's back to Mr. Healy's kind of comment about the business case to go fight Russians. My Marines came in to fight. My cyber Marines got to fight active adversaries every day. And so I've always put them in positions where they could go do that with other organizations to get the best experience possible, which is strange. Like, wait a minute, I'm deploying a Marine. I shouldn't be training them against that advanced threat in some type of, sandbox simulated environment, but I found the best training for them was to put them with organizations that were in the fight today, and they come back and make their other Marines better. And I say that from your authorities' perspective. From the cyber domain, it always frustrated me a little bit that I could, in fact, operate in the cyber domain from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I'm a service retained force, but I've got capacity to help anyone up here at Fort Meade. And we haven't resolved that yet. That's a shame. That's a shame.
The creativity that goes along with that to say, we have developed a language and a lexicon to sort of communicate language very, very, things very quickly. A vampire attack, right, would be one for the surface warfare community would recognize, a vampire calls you smirking because we do this a lot. That kind of, somebody says that because some operator is trained to understand the difference between a surface search radar to a fire control radar to, hey, that's a seeker head of a weapons system. I'm making the call, and then actions, authorities are given, to your point. The creativity in this space, and I think this is what the MCPA could be, what would constitute, what is an indication or a warning, or like, hey, the Volt Typhoon stuff, maybe it hasn't hit the criteria of that I'm going to return fires, but I am going to bird dog this. I am like laser focused on watching what's going on now, because the minute something was broken, okay, which would maybe constitute an attack, and then we're working with whatever organization. But we haven't even created the language around that yet.
Yep, so battle drills, pre-approved authorities that are commensurate with that drill, right, that closes that time decision loop.
Yeah, so that's a good question in the submarine domain in particular, right? And so I am an expert in that. and I'm going to make some observations based only on what I read in Tom Clancy novels. And so my expectation is, and that what you hope is that your sensor system, in fact, detects the torpedo. And you hope it detects the torpedo not on final run-in with an active seeker, but you detect it because you've detected the platform that has a torpedo. And if that is in fact the system, then you're going to be in a position to make a response decision, right? I agree that the ROE is largely constrained, and it might in fact be too constrained. The thing that we need industry and others to help us reconcile is how do we get more insight into adversary maneuver, adversary readiness, adversary positioning, so that we can always be aware and cognizant of any and all adversaries all the time. So that if we do it really, really well, we could perhaps, with authority and alignment, preclude their ability to take any action. And that would be the best kind of offensive capability, is if we could maneuver at that kind of scale with that right kind of depth and stealth to be in a position that none of their shit just works. That would be absolutely the result of an offensive operation. And it can be done under the appropriate authorities. Your point, though, is, in the fight, I think if we're in a recognized and accepted cyber fight, I think expectation will follow, and with expectation comes authorities and alignment.
I know we're getting short on time, so one of the ways we have resolved that in the other domains is when that ROE is pushed down, then the capabilities that those individuals have, as they get more junior, those capabilities become more limited in nature,
Yeah.
right? So a Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps has an M4, not a howitzer, so there's a limit to the effect that they can respond with, if you will. I think that if we started defining cyber capabilities in a similar manner, then there would be some utility to that. I have one question I want to bring back to Brian. Brian talked about enabling operators to improvise under certain mission conditions. But I would counter that, I would endorse that, but also say that's in tension with, I think at times cyberspace professionals want to make their own rather than rely on industry like we do in other operational domains. And so I would say just because you can code, that doesn't mean you make the best code. I can build a boat in my backyard, but I can't build a dreadnought. So I can say, well, I built a boat, but is that the best boat for the mission? So I'll start with Brian. Is there a spectrum there? What would your comment on that be?
No disagreement with you, and I didn't expand upon that well enough in terms of I had industry capability inside my command, and we'd get to the point of, hey, we can do, nope, proprietary. You got to stop here, can't do that. So I think there is an industry in Marine or Sailor or whatever model to do that collaboratively, develop code, develop capabilities right at the tactical edge. Absolutely, would be in favor of that.
Back to the top on history, the US government doesn't do arsenals and shipyards and foundries anymore. You do. And I would invite you to think about where you can with IRAD and other internal investment, try to scale that up and scale that out and be more dynamic in the case. Make a pitch, do the appropriate lobbying, which is legal, by the way, to get the US government to somehow support and sustain that funding with a different kind of a mechanism. I think it's the only way that we're going to compete against, the Chinese Communist Party, which is doing it at unimaginably large scale.
And my last closing comment will be a pitch to the MCPA, right? So I think what we're mostly trying to advocate for here is we're not necessarily contractors or whatever, right? We're all members of this community, and for whatever thought, idea, whether it's floundering in your own company or in your own brain or wherever, the MCPA is, we're certainly trying to position ourselves to be a voice for those things, or a megaphone, or maybe just a delivery system.
Bring it.
A collection, or a collection. I think as you've seen from a history perspective, if you snap the chalk line and say, 2010 was the beginning of the cyber career, the USCYBERCom, we'll just use that as a date. How do we begin to sort of collect the knowledge of the community? What is the history? Who's the scribe, outside of things that Jay has done in the past with the book, and he better write his second book soon to come up with what has happened since he finished his last book. But where's the knowledge? Where's the scribe that's sort of collecting all of these things? And then some of them are legitimate things that were worthy of white papers or championing or shouting from a rooftop. And I think the MCPA is trying to position ourselves we are trying to position ourselves to be that voice.
Look, undersea warfare wasn't a thing in 1900. Okay, air power and air warfare was not a thing in 1920, even though they sank my battleship. Space power was not a thing until 1957. Okay, so I don't know when cyber became a thing or not, but it is absolutely a thing today. And for the U.S., all domain, multi-domain, whatever it is, you're not going to get there, you're not going to stay there, you're not going to be there, you're not going to do there without cyberspace, right? Period.
I said joint a lot, just I'm coming back to your question. It's also a coalition world. When you talk about authorities, you know, being able to work, that's our strength against the Chinas. It's everyone working together. And there's a capability aspect of that too. Just like the Admiral said about, you know, M4, M16, you know, we can share 5.56 rounds with our allies.
Yeah.
What's that looking like it's cyber? Let's do that a little bit quicker too. So
That's good.
Yep.
And with that, it's one team,
That's
one
right.
fight. So let's go ahead and give our panelists.
Yep.